My name is Average Joe, and I'm a proud geek with expertise in movies, superheroes, and animation.
My name is Beef Pork Ribs. I'm a fine repository of esoteric knowledge, which I suppose most people would qualify as geeky. Though I dabble in many fandoms, my main areas of expertise are anime, movies, and Belgian comics, with a strong recent insurgency of D&D.
Our mission is to bring nerd and geek culture to the masses
By sticking it all under the microscope.
Welcome to the Bat Jar Podcast.
Movies, comics, graphic novels, TV, cartoons, animation, nerds are geeks, entertainment culture. Hear it on the Bat Jar, Nerdy Pound. Nerds and geeks, come gather around the scene. Come and join us in the Bat Jar. Come and tune into Average Joe and his team. Lots of room here in the Bat Jar. When the newest nerdy news drops, these podcast pals put it under the scope. DC, Marvel, Disney, Star Wars, cinematic multiverses. Mega Christmas, Grinch's franchise. Hear it on the Bat Jar, Nerdy Power.
And welcome to the Bat Jar Podcast, where we put nerd and geek culture under the microscope.
You know, I was going to look into saying something in an imaginary... Oh, we are dumb. Ba weep gra na weep nini bong, y'all.
So for those who don't know, Beef Pork Ribs is speaking the universal greeting or whatever it was from the 80s Transformers movie.
Yeah, man. I feel like that would have been better than trying to say hello there in Klingon, but for those who didn't figure out what Average Joe was trying to do.
Yes, I attempted to speak Klingon. I've never spoken Klingon before, but there is, of course, a website where you can translate things from English into Klingon. So that's why we're here today. I am not a linguist. I'm a unilingual, English-speaking individual. I have a very basic comprehension of French. I've learned a little bit about how Japanese and Spanish work, but I'm really not an expert on this. I apologize if there's any actual linguists who listen to this podcast. This episode is going to make you cringe really, really hard.
But we're trying our best.
I mean, you at least know 2 languages, so you're more an expert than I am.
I mean, I learned some Spanish when I was in high school, but it didn't stick.
Now, I'm trying to remember. I'm going to look back into our email because I'm pretty sure it was Eliza Phyllis that emailed us about this.
About something specifically to add to the podcast or asking for this episode?
Asking for this episode. So this is from an Eliza Jane Phyllis. So she sent this email August 27th, 2020. So it's taken us a while to get here. I just finished listening to the latest podcast while doing mindless spreadsheet work. Thank you for keeping me from going crazy. And I heard that once again there was nothing in the Bat Jar, so I decided not to procrastinate and actually send in my topic idea this week. Since I was little, I have been fascinated by Tolkien's detailed world building and particularly his creation of multiple languages. I know this isn't a phenomenon exclusive to Lord of the Rings. There are courses offered in Klingon, for example, and I think it might even be an option on Duolingo. I haven't done too much research into this, but I think it would be interesting to learn about the world of nerd and geek linguistics. Thanks.
And to make a little callback to what you said earlier, we are not linguists, but guess who was? Tolkien.
Okay. I'm like, maybe he's talking to somebody else. I don't know.
Yes. No, it was Tolkien. It explains a lot why he could do a lot better than most people for that.
Yeah, it's kind of funny. Like, we've talked in recent weeks about the use of language in certain films and how there's like a stereotype in at least, American-made films that everyone knows English, and even if you're going to another planet, people somehow know to speak English. Or if it's an anime, everyone knows Japanese.
Or really, really bad English.
And you have to wonder, you think of the Earth we live on, there's like hundreds of languages. And even of the languages that do exist, there are variations. Like people who live in one country who speak English won't be able to understand people who live in a different country who speak the same language. So I've always found it kind of weird in sci-fi and fantasy that all these different races and groups of people and like a whole planet, I guess, would speak the same language.
I mean, It's an interesting. We'll get to that when the thing that I added to the agenda comes. But there are certain settings that kind of work their way around it, with the idea of like the common tongue or common, which is usually like how they get away with having English in a lot of these kind of universes as the language everybody understands. Although it really wouldn't be English, but I guess we can get to that a little bit later. But yeah, it is interesting, and it is, I don't know, like it does seem to be a lot more American centric. I think, yeah, because we talked about like movies made in Europe and how they usually will have people speaking different languages and just have some subtitles, and we're working towards that. But it's true that there is a certain how do I say, like, difference in immersion, because I get that, like, from people on both sides of the eternal anime debate, subs versus dubs, that some people are like, it's better when it's in Japanese because you get to the real feeling for it, even though, sometimes, like, you're watching an anime like part 1 and 2 of JoJo's Bizarre Adventure where they should be speaking English because that's the native tongue of the characters. And then that argument kind of doesn't make as much sense. And there's some people who say, well, no, I have to be able to understand it to get a full immersion. Otherwise, if I'm just reading the subtitles, I'm missing something of it.
Yes, and so we're kind of talking about the use of fictional languages, which means, like, obviously it's a language that's been invented by the original creator for the sake of it being part of the world of the story. And, I have a friend who reads a lot of fantasy books. And I said to him, what do you think about the idea of there being fictional languages in a book? Because obviously you're not going to be able to read the language because you've never heard it before. And most of the time, if there is a fictional language in the book and the characters are speaking that language, like if there's a written version of that language that appears in the text you read, it's probably going to come along with some kind of translation that says, oh, like they were saying this to each other in their, whatever special language. I said, like, is this helpful, or do you enjoy this when you really can't appreciate it when it's written down like that? And he said yes, because for him, it helps the world building. It makes it seem like the world in which the story takes place is a lived in world that, and especially in the fantasy setting, that it's like foreign to him. And as the reader, he's like, he can see this is not the world I live in. And it feels like this is a whole culture that exists beyond my understanding. So,
yeah, as long as you don't fall into the pit hole of just making it an other version of English, because I think that's one of the problems. What I find is a problem with immersion. It's one of the reasons I did not create any languages. I created different alphabets for some of the fantasy things I've written or done, working as a dungeon master as well. But I've never tried to do another language. A, I'm not a linguist. But B, I do actually, because, and I guess this does come from being bilingual, like there is a pretty big difference in the way that certain words have come about, and especially in the way that like expressions and turns of phrases get said or get created, or even like, I don't know, the easiest example for me is like there's way more verb tenses in French than in English, because there are specific things and specific ways to say certain things in French that just don't exist in English. And that has to do with the culture in some way, but also has to do with the roots of the language. And there's just so much that goes into what goes into a language that I was like, yeah, I'm not going to approach that.
We, of course, I mean, Eliza referred to it in her email, but we, of course, can't really have a conversation about fictional languages without going back to J.R.R. Tolkien, who, if people don't remember who he is, he's the writer of the Lord of the Rings series. I saw an interview with him today where he referred to new languages are like a new wine. And he just seemed to have this fascination with creating new languages. And I'm not a Lord of the Rings person, but I understand that he created several different languages and then kind of created higher and lower versions of the languages, and he like created generational versions of the languages. To me, that seems like a lot of work.
Yes, but especially I think where it pays dividends in obvious ways even is just in the naming of things, right? Because like for example, if you can't remember who's Arwen and who's Eowyn because their names sound similar, well, remember that Eowyn has the Eo, which is the termination for horse, which is which is why you find it in a lot of names from Rohan, like her brother Eomir, right? They have the same beginning, and there's also names that have that around around there because it is a culture that's built around horses. The horse lords, they're semi-nomadic, and so when you start naming things, because I that is something that is super useful. Like as a writer, I do some writing, not really a lot, and as a dungeon master too, like having things that have a common root, which is why often, because I can kind of get away with it because most people don't speak more than one language, I will usually actually pick like different races in D&D. I will give them a different language. Like for a while, dark elves. Actually, this is something a friend of ours started, but the dark elves all had Spanish names and a Spanish accent. But like picking different languages to go with different races, because that way you can come up with names that sound kind of more normal, right? Because when you're trying to make up a bunch of names for a bunch of characters, and then you have elves and dwarves that are both called Fred, something's not working because they're supposed to be such different races and different people. And so I do understand like the usefulness of that way. And obviously Tolkien put way too much effort into everything he did for Lord of the Rings and the world of Middle Earth, but it is still something that I think is useful and can, like you said, especially in fantasy and sci-fi settings, can add a lot to what, to the way the world works, but you have to put the necessary effort into it, right? Like you said something in Klingon. Klingon is a harsh, but also short language, right? Most of the words don't have too many syllables in it. And the Klingons are a military civilization. So it makes sense that their language would be short and to the point and not very flowery, right? Somewhat like if the Vulcans had a different language, it'd probably be somewhat similar, less harsh, but still probably very factual and to the point, but probably more precise, right? Because they want people to know exactly what they're saying and not misinterpret them, because misinterpretation isn't really part of their DNA. And so I think that's the hardest thing with fictional languages, is trying to consider the cultural roots in which this language would have been created and make it relevant.
I hadn't really thought about that. Your point here about how the language, if you start with that, it can inform a lot of the culture, even to the point of, you said, naming characters. That's really interesting. Maybe he wasn't so crazy.
I mean, I'll be honest, I have probably thought about some of these things a bit more, not necessarily in the fictional universe, but because I do teach, I am a teacher. I don't teach French, but I'm a French speaking teacher in a minority setting. And so we do need to, like, I have to talk to my students about why should they speak French, because a lot of them, they're teenagers and they're like, oh, everybody speaks English. Why should I speak French? And you need to understand, in order to explain to, especially to teenagers, but to anybody, why you care about your language. You can't just say, well, it's part of your culture, because, well, if you don't explain how it's part of your culture, it's just like saying, because I said so. And as I'm sure teenagers don't take too well to because I said so. And so, like, a lot of that, how the language is developed and why there are certain expressions or certain words, I'm sure from similar background to me that there are 3 words for love in Greek, right? There's eros, philos, and agape, and they all mean different things. And then, and then the different, like in French and English, saying I like you and I love you, you say it the same way in French, right? And so, and those have to do usually with like things that are culturally important.
So again, we're kind of emphasizing how important language is to culture and to writing a story. And so we're not talking about real languages here. We're talking about what's called conlang, which is like a portmanteau of the term constructed language. So we're talking about constructed languages that have been created for fiction. If J.R.R. Tolkien hadn't put so much effort into developing all the different languages and the variations of them for The Lord of the Rings, who knows where we would be today? Probably somebody else would have come along and created a different language for some kind of fictional story. But it's important to know that this started with literature. So while there probably aren't large sections, maybe I haven't read The Lord of the Rings, but are there sections of the book where there's like dialogue written in, Elvish or Dwarfish or Dwarfish? I don't know if that's a language.
Yes. Not a lot though. Not a lot in Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit. There's some that's written. Sometimes it's spoken. But also it does, but in the Silmarillion, obviously it's a different story. There's a lot more of it that bleeds through and in the appendices. So it is more of a thing if you take a deep dive, but it was still, documented and, is part of what, when they made the movie, they did actually look into it to have, to add some word in High Elven and in Dwarvish and in, even just in the old tongue of the Men of Numenor, which is closer to Elvish and isn't quite English either.
So as far as I can tell, Sindarin is credited as the first conlang, the first constructed language. And Sindarin, if I'm even saying that correctly, that's one of the versions of Elvish.
I think it's Sindarin.
Sindarin.
I'm not sure.
Oh, it's a conlang. It doesn't matter how he's... It's not
Actually,
real.
It does, because Tolkien specifically had pronunciation keys for his languages.
Oh, darn
because
it.
he was a linguist, but...
so Sindarin, that's one of the Elvish languages, correct?
Yeah.
Is that the High Elves?
I believe it's High Elven.
Okay. And this is one of the languages that has been so developed over the years that literally people have learned how to speak this language, which in my mind, that's like an area of geekdom, nerddom that I don't have the capacity for, probably because I'm unilingual and I can't even learn French, let alone Sindarin.
Yeah. Although it's interesting because there is like real life applications. Again, I know these things because like I'm a teacher, but there are people like linguists who very specifically will do something similar to that. Like what I'm trying to say is that the root of this isn't necessarily in fantasy, because there are linguists who will take dead languages or languages that were only spoken and we only have like records of people who spoke it and start reconstructing it. In fact, in Canada, there's a lot of First Nation languages that only exist in the writings of mostly missionaries, but, of European colonists, and they are starting to get reconstructed because there was enough. They're not 100% sure that the pronunciation is perfect, but there is an effort that's being made to reconstruct languages. So that is something that does exist and that is possible to do. It's very complicated and way beyond me. I had a friend who was part of some of these efforts, and he started explaining some of it, and it's fascinating, but it's also... so I guess it's not just fandoms that do it, but they definitely have jumped on the bandwagon. And again, Tolkien being a linguist, I feel like a lot of his fans do have a bit more of that kind of passion, and there's probably a lot more linguists who are Tolkien fan than other forms of media. So I think it makes sense that particular language had a bunch of people who know what they're doing, who developed it into like a full-blown language.
I watched a linguist today in a YouTube video kind of breaking down like some of the most popular conlangs, most popular constructed languages. And he kind of explained that, it's obviously regardless of like who the intended, speakers of these languages are, obviously it's a human being who lives on Earth coming up with this. So human languages kind of have to be the foundation for these languages. And he kind of illustrated how some of these languages kind of emphasize the use of different parts of the mouth. Like some involve a lot of throat sounds, some a lot of sinus, kind of how you speak with your nose, or different sounds you can make with your mouth. And admittedly, not having like a lens to look at things that way, it made sense. And some of these, especially when you get into like the sci-fi stuff, you have to kind of look at how the creatures are designed. Like, what shape are their mouths in? Because their capacity to make certain sounds will be based on what they've got to work with. Like, I guess for Parcel Tongue in the Harry Potter movies, when they got around to having characters speak it, they're like, well, what does a snake's mouth look like? What are sounds snakes can't even make? So therefore, they would have to have some kind of lisp because there's certain letters they just can't say.
Yeah, and that's the other thing that goes into figuring out, which I feel is, again, that one's more for sci-fi, because in fantasy, most humanoids are, well, humanoids, so they could feasibly make the same sounds, but I feel like often like dwarvish will be a little more guttural and a little more deeper. I don't know, smaller, more stout.
Think about people. Like an orc, they got like those big teeth, like under.
Yeah. And then you've got World of Warcraft, where the orcs inexplicably have a Jamaican accent, but but that's an accent, not a language, so I guess it's different.
I also watched a different video where they kind of highlighted how you could go about creating your own language. And they seemed like they were focusing more on like spoken language, let alone like compared to written language. But they kind of emphasized that if you're going to create a language, you have to create your own set of grammar. You got to try and incorporate features that would make your language sound unique. For example, this one person said, like, Japanese have these suffixes that kind of end certain sentences. And if you're a reader, like reading a book where they have this fictional language, if you could kind of introduce features that would be borrowed from human languages, your readers can start picking up on these things and start noticing tone and intonation based on how you're choosing to, craft your sentence structure. And I don't know if this is necessarily true, but they said that every sentence has a subject, an object, and a verb. And you can kind of shift those around to create the structure for your language. They use the example of Yoda, because even though Yoda is speaking English, the way he structures his sentences make very little sense to us. It sounds like he doesn't know what he's talking about.
Yeah, but which also has to do with, and there's also, you have to think of the difference. Is it going to be your word order or your word structure that defines what they are? Because, for example, in Latin, Latin kind of has both. It has the order in which a word is in a sentence is important, but also the end of the word might define what that word is, or whether it is like a demonstrative word or a comparative word will depend on the ending of it, rather than having a different word, which you kind of have in English somewhat. Long, longer, longest, it's all the end of the word that defines what type of long you're looking at.
Right.
And the thing that I think is also kind of isn't in what you talked about, but I think you said it, vocabulary, because that's also kind of an important one. When you're making your language, you should consider the vocabulary of the people that you're writing for. Like, if you were to write I don't know. Do the sand people have like a real language, or is it just sounds that kind of sound similar enough to be a language? Because that would be interesting, because they probably would have a lot of words for sand or types of sand. Kind of the way that.
Do you mean like the Tusken Raiders in Star Wars?
Yes, that's what I mean.
Okay, I thought you were talking about the Saiyans from Dragon Ball.
Oh no, but they probably would have like also a different vocabulary, right? Like. Yeah, like, what was it? Like, there's 23 different words for snow. Yeah.
And then there's...
And who knows? Maybe one means victory. Maybe one means, complete victory. I don't know. They're military-ish. Like, one means we've killed our enemy. One means we've captured our enemies. But they probably have, like, similar but probably different words for those things, because it's a distinction that's important. Somewhat like in Canada, and... we have different ways to talk about snow than a lot of other countries. Like, a lot of countries would just say snow. But if I tell you, we got powder snow or sticky snow, I mean, we're technically only adding adjectives, but there are languages that have different words for different types of snow, right? And that's also something to consider, right? Like if you're living on a, you've got the language of a planet that has a bunch of different animals that you ride, well, there's probably a different word for all of them, but that might be similar or might be completely different.
Now, you mentioned in our little show notes Creoles, and from what I recall, is that like a permutation of a language based on like a specific cultural context?
Yeah, so, well, Pigeons and Creoles is what I wrote, and they are similar in the sense that they are mixes of languages. And you tend to have a lot of them, which I think is kind of cool in sci-fi. Like, I'm watching The Expanse, as I said, since, I have a baby that keeps me up a lot. And they do, like, the people who live on the asteroid belt speak in a way that's slightly different than English, but, like, they have, certain words that they'll say that kind of sound like English, but aren't quite English. Like, Baratna is their word for brother. And, when they're speaking to each other, they'll have a bit of like the people from the Rings have a bit of an accent, but also have certain words they use in a certain way, which usually involves like crunching words together or mixing words from a different language in it. And it's a similar thing is in Firefly, where there's a lot of Chinese thrown into the kind of dialect that they speak. Like, they're speaking English, but they're going to like throw in Chinese words, mostly curses, in that one specifically. But you tend to have a lot of that in sci-fi. Specifically, though, usually science fiction that has the basis that Earth colonized space, because that's where it makes the most sense. But you do have it in other kind of in other settings, and that's where I wanted to come back to talking about like the idea of the common tongue, right? Usually, or the way it's supposed to be understood and originally was understood in things like Dungeons and Dragons, was that the common tongue was like a mix of Elvish and human and Orcish, usually, or the main languages, so that there are words from kind of everywhere, but it's a language that's universal, not because everybody speaks it and has specific grammar rules that everybody understands, but because it's a mix of all other languages, and enough of these words to be able to communicate, right? Like, you wouldn't be able, like, and that, which is why it's kind of weird that common is kind of taken as, oh, that's what everybody speaks, but really it should be more like a trade language that everybody can understand enough to communicate, but you wouldn't like write a book in common because it doesn't actually have like specific grammars or or syntax, or very it's not a specific language. It would be more of a mix of different languages.
Well, you mentioned trade, and what wouldn't English be considered like common for like Earth, because seemingly everyone has to know English
somewhat, but again, the English wouldn't be proper English. It'd be English words, and like a more of a broken version of English that might also involve other words from other languages, especially depending on what or where you're trading.
So you would rather, in sci-fi settings, like especially when you have people interacting from different planets, that there'd be if there is a shared language, it wouldn't necessarily just be straight English.
Yeah, which I think sometimes happens, but like, yeah, it would be, which you do kind of get, but the problem is usually it's kind of like a derogatory, oh, they're not intelligent enough to speak properly, like the Gungans in Star Wars, right? But if you think about it, if there was a common tongue in the galaxy and it was English, then yeah, it would make sense that most people who aren't from a specific English-speaking planet, wouldn't speak it very well, or would speak it differently, or would speak maybe a broken version of it, and this is where it's weird, because Yoda has this. Yoda has learned the common tongue, but he's probably originally spoke a language that had a different sentence structure, and that's why his sentence structure is different, right? That would make sense. Like French people, like French and English have different order in which the words are usually, and so it would make sense that somebody who not somebody who mastered English, but somebody who's starting to learn English might speak it kind of in the wrong order. I definitely did when I started speaking English.
So in like Lord of the Rings, when like the Fellowship of the Ring are all together, are these what language are they speaking there?
No, they're speaking the common tongue.
So there is a common language.
Yeah, but that's what it is called I'm pretty sure it's called the common tongue in Lord of the Rings.
I see.
And and they would speak it, but like I don't know. I like to think that probably Gandalf and Frodo would speak in High Elven when they speak alone sometimes, because well, nobody else can understand it I think Aragorn might speak it, but like nobody else in the party could understand it, and they could have conversations. But and even in the movie, like sometimes like Gimli getting mad at the elves for not speaking a language everybody can understand. Now, of course, for simplicity's sake, and I think in Lord of the Rings there is a common language which was codified more or less, and I think it's the language of men, but it also, which is also weird when you think about it, because hobbits also have speak the common tongue. They don't speak Hobbit,
Hobbitese,
which
Hobbitish.
which is a little bit odd, and which is again where like Dungeons and Dragons has different language for almost every race, which makes it even harder to have a common tongue.
Right, but that doesn't really impact you're actually playing in Dungeons and Dragons, because you're not being asked to speak these different languages.
No, of course not. But it is something. But it is something where it could be, because you could enforce that you can't say very complicated things in common. Like you go up to a Dragonborn and he speaks mostly Draconic, but he can kind of understand what you're saying in common, but he might miss some of the nuances, right? You definitely can enforce that. I don't personally, but like it, because it is complicated. But I do know some people who might want a more immersive gameplay, and you could definitely do that, right? And I think it would be more immersive. Or sometimes, and I have friends who are dungeon masters who do this. They're like, yeah, no, humans don't all speak the same language. There's like 4 different languages that the humans speak depending where you are, and they all understand the common tongue, but if you want to have a conversation with somebody, you need to speak their language.
Well, regardless if you're reading, I would argue that the experience of other languages, or these, conlangs, it takes it to a whole nother level when it's some kind of visual media, whether like if it's a movie or a TV show. When it's written in a book, you can't experience it the same way. It helps with the world building and the naming of things, and helps kind of establish the cultures of the world, and it makes the world feel more real. But it's another thing entirely, I would say, to experience it. So we're going to kind of dive into some of the most popular instances of conlangs from fiction. I think we should start with the one that's the most different, and that's from the movie Arrival. Because the language, like that movie's all about language, and it supposes what if an alien entity that was completely foreign to us and did not perceive time the same way we did, tried to communicate with us. And the language of the heptapods in the movie is meant to be a visual language that again represents this unique perspective of time. And I don't know about you, but when I saw that movie, I thought it was very interesting.
I have not seen that movie, so I can't
really.
Is that the one with Jake Gyllenhaal and Ryan Gosling? Not Ryan Reynolds.
No, this is Amy Adams, Jeremy Renner, Forrest Whitaker, 2016.
Oh, yeah, I have it, but I've never seen it. Well, to be fair, Mjolnir has it, or had it. We now share a DVD collection, but yeah, I've never seen it. But okay. But it sounds like it's a little bit like kind of the weirdness that was the movie just called First Contact?
Yes, I've never.
No,
seen
Close Encounter. No, sorry. Yes, there is a movie called First Contact, but I was thinking about Close Encounters of the Third Kind.
That's a Spielberg movie, right?
Yes, in which there is there's the melody, there's the lights, and there's kind of like the psychic imaging message that goes in, and it's actually an alien life form communicating in several different ways with humans, and they're all trying to decipher what it might mean.
So that's probably a good example, as well as it's a version of a language that is completely kind of totally foreign to humans, but because
alien
we're not,
in both sense of the word.
Yes. You mentioned Star Wars already, and Star Wars' approach to language is very, very odd, because you get characters like Chewbacca, for example, who understands English, when people are talking to him, but then he seems to only have the capacity to speak in his like Wookie accent or Wookie language. And then you have certain characters like Han Solo who can understand that Wookiee language, but they choose to respond in English instead of talking to him in his native language. And that seems weird to me because I can't think of any like actual, like, for example, you wouldn't if I were to be able to understand French, you wouldn't talk French to me and then I would respond to you in English.
I mean, somewhat, but again, we're talking about like languages that work in a different way, and I think actually Chewbacca is less weird than like Jabba, because Jabba speaks Huttese usually, right? I think that's the name of the language but like he usually speaks that way, right? And like it's the same thing with I can't remember his name, the traitor who owns Anakin at the beginning of Phantom Menace, like
Watto.
Like it makes sense that, you know, they've got a different physiognomy. They probably are able to make different sounds, so they only, you know, it would make sense for them to understand, you know, English, but only respond in Huttese because they're not able to make the sounds necessary for English, but they do, which is weird. Like at least for Jabba, they gave him a lot of an accent, and he kind of like speaks in a weird speech pattern. But yeah, exactly. But a lot of them just speak perfect English and then speak their other language. I think Chewbacca makes a lot more sense. Like, he can't speak English because his vocal cords aren't shaped in a way that you could actually speak English, but he can understand it. And likewise, and I mean, look, how many people do you know who can actually do a good Chewbacca impression? It's something that's really hard and that most humans aren't necessarily able to do. So, like, I'm sure if Han was able to speak, you know, yeah, Wookiee, he probably would. Well, maybe not. He's kind of, you know, kind of a jerk to his friends, but like he you know, he probably, if he could, he probably would. Which is like where something like somebody like C-3PO, because he can create any kind of sounds because he's a robot. He can
he's
just
a droid.
speak all the different droids. Sorry, droids are technically a robot, but anyway. The robots with advanced AI, but yes, but he does speak, you know, in Return of the Jedi. He tells the whole story, you know, the whole saga to the Ewok, right? Because he's capable of speaking the language, right? But at the beginning, they're like speaking to him in Ewok, and he's basically responding in English, or mostly for the benefit of the audience and of the other people around, but he does have the capacity to both understand and speak all these languages, so it makes sense that he does. Whereas like Chewbacca might not have the capacity to speak English.
There's certain sci-fi properties, especially, that kind of find ways to get around the issue of language. I think
the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy.
Hitchhikers, where they
That's
have like
the best one, the babblefish.
What is it, like a worm that goes in your ear that allows you to understand?
It's a fish.
It's a fish, and
it feeds off of the brain waves of the person speaking and redirects it into your ear so that you understand what they're saying.
Okay. My personal favorite is the Green Lantern logic, where the Green Lantern rings have a universal translator built into the ring, so the person who's wearing the ring can understand any language being spoken to them, and any language that they speak can be understood by the recipient in the language of their choice.
Yeah, but again, it's a little bit of a cop-out.
Oh, it totally is a cop-out.
No, but it doesn't have to be, right? Because you could have people who have different speech patterns, but it's still in English, right? Like a little bit how like Thor speaks kind of closer to Middle English in the first movies. It could be like a translation thing, but Asgardian just sounds more flowery, you know, or more like Middle English. You still understand what he's saying, but he's saying it in a way that, you know, he's speaking in a way that other people wouldn't speak, you know? You could still have that. And it's the same thing with like, of course, the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy doesn't care about things like that because it's not about world building. It's literally about the absurd. But something like, you know, like Star Wars could have that kind of like, you've got a universal translator, but it still doesn't sound like you and I speaking English when somebody from an alien race speaks English.
There's a really great episode of the Green Lantern animated series where he's traveling with another Green Lantern and a Red Lantern, and coincidentally, all their rings die, like run out of juice. So they lose all their powers, and they lose the ability to communicate with each other because they're all from different species, and they have to spend the whole episode trying to like communicate with like hand signs and non-verbal communication because they don't.
Are they all more or less humanoid though? Do
They're all
have
humanoid,
hands?
yes, but one's like
that's
Kilowatt.
unfortunate because that
There's
would
like
have been that would have been even more interesting. One of them doesn't have hands, can't do hand signals.
Yeah, thankfully it wasn't that difficult for them. In Atlantis: The Lost Empire, they kind of cheat, I guess, because the version of Atlantean they create, they call it a root language, so it includes elements of a lot of.
Oh yeah, because it's like all languages in the world come from Atlantean.
Yeah, so it's like has the version of Atlantean that they speak has elements of English and French and other Earth-based languages.
Which, if you were smart, you would. Anyways, you would try to use some kind of Proto-Sumerian or as close as you can to it, because that is kind of the beginning of language on Earth.
That's kind of what Latin is, right? Because it's like the root of a lot of the languages.
Yeah, Latin is the root of a lot of a few European languages, like the Romance languages, like French, Spanish, Italian, Romanian, and Portuguese. But like Spanish and Portuguese have massive Arabic influence, which is completely different language. French has some Germanic influence, but not much. And then Italian is probably the one that's closest and purest. But again, the problem with that is that, like, yeah, there's a lot of languages that form other languages.
Yeah, admittedly, I mean, it's mostly a cop-out because it establishes a precedent for all the Atlanteans to be able to speak English. But then for those few moments where they want to have like an Atlantean conversation, they can speak in this like constructed language they've made up.
Yeah, which is funny too, because Atlantis, because the Atlantis, the Disney movie, for some reason the Atlanteans can speak every language, or at least, they can speak French and English and I think Spanish at some point, or Greek, I can't remember. But like the Atlanteans can speak all languages, and it seems a little weird. Maybe Atlantis is just that magical.
The Game of Thrones universe has two languages that are referred to in the books, but they're actually spoken for the first time in the HBO series. So apparently there's Valerian, which has high and low versions, and then there's one called Dathroki.
There's also Gish.
Now, I haven't watched Game of Thrones or read the books, so I've only seen clips of people speaking these languages. But they explain that there's the one character with the white hair who it kind of like shows her progression as a character.
Yeah. Oh, actually, I don't think they speak Gish in the show, come to think of it. I think all the people from that should speak Gish in the show speak Valerian.
I see. Now, I imagine it's probably a much more immersive experience watching the show than hearing them just say, oh, like they were speaking in Valerian, like in the book, especially for, like I said, I think it's Emilia Clarke's character, the woman with the white hair. Like at the start of the series,
Daenerys Targaryen.
Thank you. She's like learning Dathroki at the start of the series, so she's not speaking it very well. But then it's like part of her character growth that, as time goes on, she knows to speak a lot better.
Yes, I mean it's part of her character growth in the first season, but yeah, it is part of that.
Now, I haven't seen this show, so I can't speak to it, but I think you've seen Game of Thrones. Does having the other languages in there help?
Yeah, no, definitely. It does, and it does also kind of make it seem like a more real world. And and they do actually use it. Like there's some scenes where it's like, where actually Daenerys pretends to not understand Valerian when it's being spoken around her, and then starts speaking it. And they're like, oh no, she understood everything we were saying, because they were insulting her behind her back by speaking a language they thought she didn't understand. And so it was, an interesting scene. And they definitely use that quite a bit. And they also... It's also interesting because Valerian also is the root language for all the languages in across the Narrow Sea. So all the, like, places that aren't the Seven Kingdoms, the main setting, all kind of have the root language, except for the Dathroki because they are a completely different culture. But all the like civilized world speaks versions of Valerian because Valeria invaded things. And it's not very important, but it is cool that like they did, you know, both in the book and in the show, they kind of look at it that way, and they do acknowledge that, yeah, no, this language not only is spoken in certain places, but also influenced a lot of other places too.
Now I spoke a little bit of Klingon there at the beginning. Star Trek, you know, started in the 60s, but the first time you ever heard Klingon was very briefly in the 1979 Star Wars movie, or Star Wars. Oh, I don't like Star Trek.
Wow.
I don't even.
Somebody is going to get really mad at you. Many people are going to get very mad at you.
Okay, sorry. The Star Trek movie from 1979. There's like a few moments of Klingons speaking Klingon in that movie, and it wasn't until I guess the third Star Trek movie that they brought in the guy to actually formally create the whole language.
Really? I would have thought it was first with the Next Generation because there is a Klingon character.
Well, according to the video I watched, the guy said he was brought in to work on the third movie, and he kind of explained how he had to take what was just sort of made up for the first movie.
And like, try to include it in.
Yeah, he was like, okay, here's the sentence structure. I guess I got to work with this as like the foundation for what I'm doing here. The third movie was in 1984, so I believe that still predates Next Generation.
I want to say yes, but I am not a Trekkie or a Trekker.
So I think Klingon, even more than the Elvish languages in Lord of the Rings, is probably the most popular conlang that exists.
Yeah, I think so. I think possibly because, from my understanding of it, it is a simpler language than, you know, Elven is, but probably because it was developed faster, and also because of the differences between, you know, Klingons and elves. You know, Klingons...
Don't they both have pointy ears?
Do Klingons have pointy ears?
No,
I know
sorry,
those are ridges.
We're making all the Trekkies cry. I think it's the Vulcans.
Well, no, Klingons might also have pointy ears.
They got pointy foreheads.
Yeah, but there's this thing in like fantasy and sci-fi where you just give pointy ears to everything. So I don't know. It's possible.
Apparently, he wanted Klingon to not sound like any known human language. So you mentioned how it's very short and abrupt, and there's like a lot of. It's a very
guttural,
abrupt language.
Yeah.
And to his credit, I mean, at the end of the day, it only shows up in short parts of Star Trek stuff, and there's always subtitles so we can understand it. But yeah, it certainly sounded foreign to me in the parts that I've watched.
Yeah, and I think it's also like, it's weird to say, but Star Trek was a bigger cultural phenomenon than Lord of the Rings, like directly, especially in geek fandom. Like Tolkien has permeated everything fantasy, but Lord of the Rings in of itself isn't necessarily the same kind of media monolith that Star Trek ended up being. And it was definitely in a different setting than Lord of the Rings came out, right? Lord of the Rings came out before geekdom really existed, whereas Klingon, you know, especially because it was developed in the 80s, that's when, you know, being a nerd, a super fan, all these terms started to pop up. Conventions started to be a real thing. Like Star Trek was one of the first shows that had dedicated conventions to it, and so in that way it had a bigger influence on kind of mainstream media than Lord of the Rings directly had at its time, even though, again, I'm not saying that Tolkien is less influential than Star Trek. I'm just saying there was a time where Star Trek was really big and directly influenced a lot of things, whereas Lord of the Rings just has more of a general influence on a lot of things.
Yeah, I mean, you're right. It speaks to the nature of the fandom and how invested the fandom is, and how there's like a Shakespeare, Hamlet, like they've made plays in Klingon. And I think it speaks to, like, I think the idea of being able to speak Klingon seems to be one of those stereotypical, like, nerdy things to do. It's like, oh, they speak Klingon, they must be a nerd. And I don't know why, again, not being a Trekkie, I don't know why Klingon took off as, like, the, like, known Star Trek language. I almost did Star Wars again. The Star Trek language, when I think there's other... races
I think
as
it was
well?
just the first one that was made.
Oh,
Because I feel like Romulan and Vulcan were made like afterwards, like after Klingon had picked up, like, oh wow, we can do this, let's do it.
yeah, it's kind of crazy to me that you can like learn how to speak Klingon. Like there's programs you can take to learn Klingon.
Dathroki has gotten to that point too, actually.
But that just shows like a level of investment in that world. It's like the only reason you'd learn this language is to, I guess, appreciate the material at a greater level, or run into other people like who speak the language.
I think it's mostly the latter. That's what fans do, right? You get obsessive about something, and then when you meet somebody else who is as obsessive, you're happy. You know, I think it is kind of part of what that is.
This brings us to the Na'vi language from the James Cameron Avatar movie, which I still haven't seen and I don't care to see. But apparently,
wow,
this
and
language...
you were mad at me for not having, or you were surprised that I hadn't seen Arrival and you haven't seen Avatar.
Listen,
look, I'm just saying one of those was not necessarily better, but definitely a lot more hype and influence around it.
That's true. That's true. But apparently, the Na'vi language has 2,000 words now. And a linguist was hired when that movie was being developed to create this language. And from the clips I've seen, it seems, it feels foreign and alien to the human characters in the movie. It does help the world feel lived in. And I guess I saw an interview with the creator of this language, and he said people seem to really enjoy coming up with new words. And he kind of gets to be the guy stamping it, being like, this is a part of the official Na'vi language, or this is not. And, I feel like once they're done making Avatar movies, he'll get tired of having to be the author.
But
of
will
the
James Cameron ever be done making the Avatar movies?
I certainly hope so.
We'll see. Yeah, I think interesting. I wonder if he made the language before they translated it. I'd be interested to know that, right? Because
I feel like that's what happened. He constructed it in its native Na'vi form, and then
after that, when the movie came out, when the Na'vi speak, because in most of the movie, when the Na'vi speak to each other, it's in English, right? Like when the main character takes on a Na'vi suit. Sorry, I played too much Mega Man Battle Network, and Na'vi is a totally different term, but like, yeah.
Hey, when he puts on... listen.
No, but that's also usually what I think of is either, Zelda or Mega Man, but because they do speak mostly, and they have like expression like "I see you, brother," which I always thought was weird. It should be "I feel you, brother," because they literally connect and feel things rather than rely on sight. But anyway, that's me nitpicking.
Getting into some gibberishy languages, apparently they call it Simlish, because in The Sims, the video game, the little people who live in The Sims don't speak. It's like a made up just gibberish language. And I've never played The Sims, but I feel like that would get so annoying just hearing go.
Yeah, there is another one that I can think of that's a similar-ish thing, but it was a real language. Well, I don't know. Are these actual like? Could you theoretically learn them to speak them, or is it actual gibberish?
I'm not sure, because apparently the reason they created Simlish is because they had a limit on how much audio they could record for the game. And they didn't want to fall into the trap of having people kind of say the same stock phrases over and over again.
Yeah. I mean, it's kind of like the Lego, the Lego approach. But I was just thinking, because I remember way back when I was a young boy, the Cirque du Soleil the clowns had everybody, because the shtick of Cirque du Soleil, for those who don't know, is that they didn't have animals. They had a language. It wasn't fully a language. It was like half gibberish, half a language, but there was enough in it that they could understand each other, which they made so that people wouldn't necessarily know if in the middle of the show they needed to adjust something. They would shout it at each other or speak to each other, and they would be communicating, but without breaking the immersion that, these are people talking to each other about technical things. It just sounds like because it's kind of a made up language that's, sounds like a clown language, that kind of worked for their purpose, and they're able to understand each other while still making it look like it's a show and they're just being, silly or clownish.
the minions. Apparently, their language is like a combination of a bunch of Earth languages, and it's just random words kind of mashed
Yeah, it's
together.
like, what was it? I used to know what they were because somebody told
Like
me that
English,
was...
Spanish, French, Korean, Mandarin.
Yeah, it's a weird one.
But apparently, that's part of why the minions are popular around the world, is because their language is like none of the languages, but it's kind of all the languages.
But it sounds enough like other languages that you can get away with it.
Yeah, like when I listen to them talk, I can. There's enough English in there that I can get a feel as to what they're trying to talk about, despite how annoying they are.
Yeah, and probably, yeah, I guess you get the same thing. Well, no, it's different because the Rainicorn, Lady Rainicorn speaks exclusively Korean in Adventure Time, but it's also a strange one.
Now, would the minion language be an example of a Creole?
Only if it's a real language. If it's just random words from different languages, then no.
Okay, yeah.
Which I think that's what it is. It is just random words, not actual sentences with... Yeah, I don't think it's actual sentences with different types, like different words from different languages. Because if it was... Here's the thing about a Pidgin or a Krill is that if you speak the root language, you can kind of understand not just words but meanings, which the minions, I don't think like you can understand the meaning behind what they say if you just heard it. Like you kind of need the context clues. From what I remember, I've seen Despicable Me once because it's a terrible... It's not a terrible movie. I've seen Despicable Me once because...
it was a bad version of Megamind.
Exactly. And I haven't seen any of the consequent movies or Minion movies, so... And I'm okay with it.
There's an anime I'm watching right now called Moonlit Fantasy. It has a Japanese name that I can't really remember, but that's the English version is called Moonlit Fantasy. And it's about a Japanese guy who gets sent to a fantasy world, and there's like a common spoken human language in the show. And then there's a common language for all of the demi-humans, for all the different races of, monsters. Okay. And when he arrives in this world, he's cursed to only be able to speak the common language of the demi-humans. So he's not able to communicate with any other human beings because he only speaks the language of the monsters.
I feel like in a world where there's only two languages, a lot of people would be bilingual, though.
Well, that's the thing. He's like cursed, right? So he's like forced.
Oh, right. Yeah. Okay. No, but I mean, other people could translate for him pretty easily.
Well, so this is what happens. Like the way he ends up interacting with the humans in this world is he uses like this magic to basically put up word balloons in front of him that have text written in the human language. So he, to human beings, he's presented as mute, but he uses magic to basically have like a whiteboard in front of him that writes text out for him.
Oh, okay.
But the weird thing is, like, for listening to it, it's Japanese, like the language.
Yeah.
All the characters are speaking Japanese. The only way you can tell that the human language is different is because the little text bubbles, little text messages he creates have like some kind of script that I know it for sure is. I mean, I don't know how to read Japanese, but I know for a fact it's not Japanese.
Right.
And in settings, I feel like there's all kinds of examples of fantasy things like that.
But they could be speaking a dialect of Japanese.
And maybe that's the answer. But again, not being able to speak actual Japanese, I can't really tell a difference between what the humans are saying, what the monsters are saying, or when there's monsters that can speak the human language. It just still sounds like they're talking in Japanese. So
yeah,
I'd be curious if they dubbed that one, if they would find a way to kind of.
They just give Scottish accents to all the monsters, like really thick Scottish accent that you can barely understand, or Welsh.
But like a show like that, it feels kind of lazy. I feel like there probably would have been an opportunity to invent a language for either the monsters or the humans, and really have there be some distinction. But they're just like, we're all speaking Japanese, ignoring the fact that it's supposed to be a fantasy world separate from Earth, and like who knows why Japanese is the language we speak here.
Who knows? It's not an isekai?
It is an isekai, yeah.
Well, then that's why, because the game was coded in Japanese.
Well, it's not a game. Like he's transported to another world.
So it's not like it's an isekai, but not like a
video game isekai.
Yeah, okay, it's not a basic isekai.
I also want to give a shout out to Kryptonian, or sometimes it's called Kryptonese. It's like the native language.
Kryptonian sounds much better.
This is one where I don't think I've ever actually seen it spoken in visual media. People have gone to the trouble of creating a Kryptonian alphabet. So there's times in comic books where you see people are speaking Kryptonian, and it's just the text, like essentially the symbols that are.
But I mean, creating an alternative alphabet is really easy.
It is, and that's why I don't think no one's really taken the effort to actually create a full language where they just have an alphabet. So when it's in visual media,
also have to justify why they have like names like Kal-El. Like the language would have to have like a bunch of apostrophes randomly in it.
Yeah. So anyway, I would like to see that explored more, because even on things like Smallville or Man of Steel, like they clearly have the written text down.
Okay. Yeah.
But they don't. They haven't really. At least I haven't seen anyone speaking a Kryptonian yet.
Yeah, and it would. I feel like it'd be good way to have like his giant floating head dad speaking to him in a different language would add weight to it.
Although perhaps that Krypton show that's like a prequel about his biological grandfather has them speaking stuff, but I haven't seen it.
That just sounds like Bardock.
Well, there's a good reason for that.
Yeah, I know, but
do you have a fictional language that you're a fan of that we haven't spoken about?
Oh, that we haven't spoken about? Smurf. We did not. I can't believe we didn't talk about Smurf.
Is there a whole different language for Smurfs?
No, you just replace words with Smurf.
Oh.
Except here's the thing, but you do replace like endings too, right? Like if you're smurfing, well, that's a verb, right? If you say he's such a Smurf, then and in French, because there's more different, because Smurfs were originally French, it's Schtroumpf in French, and they do actually add it. And also, interesting mention, they do actually have this thing in, there is one of the comics, which is about like language division in the Smurfs. It's called Schtroumpf vert Schtroumpf, because it's like, it's using like a composite word, and they're putting Smurf as the first half or the second half, and they're having a conflict about it. It's a very thinly veiled commentary on the linguistic problems in Belgium, if you know anything about it. It's cool. The Smurfs was a really weirdly political comic when it originally was, written, and then Hanna-Barbera got the rights to it, and it turned into little blue men doing funny things, which I really, really hate the Hanna-Barbera Smurf cartoons, as well as the movies that came afterwards, because of that.
I guess we didn't.
But it is a fictional language. You just replace words with one word.
And that makes me think of course, Groot, because he literally, his language is just the same sentence, and somehow the different intonations are, it's kind of like Chewbacca. It's like he's just roaring, but somehow it's understood.
Yeah, I mean, that one's a bit of a cop-out too, because he clearly doesn't have enough tone difference in what he says to actually convey different things.
So he's even worse than Chewbacca in that sense.
Yeah.
Fair enough. Well, I mean, I don't know how to give any final thoughts here. I just think it's amazing that what J.R.R. Tolkien came up with in terms of just the scope and the capacity and the influence that conlangs can have has now emerged to this global phenomenon of creating new languages and learning new languages. And arguably there's like in the fan communities, people creating languages where the authors haven't officially created alternative languages. Which,
I don't know, is very hard to do too, right? So I think it makes sense that that's why. But I don't know. I like it when it happens, but I also, because I've tried to do it, I understand why it doesn't happen. But if you can, do it. If you can't, well, it's okay.
So thank you, Eliza, for suggesting we talk about fictional languages in nerd and geek culture. I'm surprised we actually had so much to say about this, considering neither of us are really experts. Apologies to any fandoms that are really upset with us now.
I feel like a lot of it was just me talking about my experiences being bilingual.
So let us know what you thought of this episode, because you, like Eliza, could be sending us mail. And in fact, we have a piece of mail this week.
Oh.
There's no subject to this email. It just says,
That's great.
I think you should discuss the Mickey Mouse franchise or the Winnie the Pooh franchise. Both have been around for years and continue to entertain our babes to this day. And this is signed from my mom.
I see. Interesting. I mean, is Mickey Mouse a franchise? Like, is
Of
this...
course he is. Like, the Mickey Mouse stable of characters, everything around him, not necessarily like him himself.
Okay, yeah, but then it's because, I don't know, do we have to focus on things that only have Mickey Mouse in it, or do we go on all the spin-off? Because Goofy, Donald, like, they all have their own universe, and then you can throw Kingdom Hearts into that, and then you're really having, playing with fire.
Oh boy.
Well, I mean, I'm interested. I just think we might need to, like, set the parameters before we actually have the episode.
I agree. And I have lots to say about all those things, so I'm more than happy to discuss them.
Yeah, I'm good with Winnie the Pooh, too.
So thanks, Average Joe's mom, for sending us an email. And if you want to contact us like Eliza did or Average Joe's mom, then we'll remind you how you can do that.
If you want to reach the show, you can send us an email at
batjarpodcast@gmail.com.
Or you can tweet us at
The Bat Cookie Jar.
You can find the Bat Jar Podcast wherever you listen to podcasts, including YouTube, because we got a channel. Share our posts on Facebook, write reviews, give our shows a rating. This will help all people join us inside the Bat Jar, and we appreciate it dearly.
So now it's time to go into the Bat Jar and pull out our topic for next week. I'm going to make sure you can see that I'm not...
Yes, I can see. I saw the wonderful bust of Batman being lifted aloft.
Okay.
And to be fair, I would have had to see the inside of the jar to see if you were... That's okay.
Okay, what does this say?
Oh, nice! It's the Terminator movies.
Oh.
I'm going to have to rewatch them now. Which is sad because Mjolnir and I just started rewatching the Matrix movies because she's been listening to a lot of podcasts about them because the new one coming out, which... Oh, God, why is that happening? Anyways, but Terminator, I like that. That is a franchise I mostly like.
I've seen 3 of the 6. No, I've seen 4 of the 7 movies that have been made about the Terminator.
I have seen the 3 Terminator movies.
Okay, but there's more than 3.
and we will unpack that next week. I haven't seen Sarah Connor's Chronicles, but I heard good things about it.
So come back to the Bat Jar Podcast next week. We talk about the Terminator movies.
Trilogy.
And until that time, I'm Average Joe.
I'm Beef Pork Ribs.
We'll
We'll be back.